Chapter 27 discusses the 1960s. Now, there's a lot of different areas to this chapter. Let's begin with U.S. diplomacy, right? So the decade begins with the presidency of JFK, right? JFK wins a very close election over Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon, and he comes into office with what he calls the new frontier, right? So some of the things about JFK is he's very forward thinking and also very unrealistic, right? He promises that the United States can solve poverty and solve hunger. And it's like, these are great, grandiose ideas. I would love it. But in reality, promising that to people is just setting the people up to be disappointed in their government again. That's very Wilsonian, and we can rid the world of all wars, right? And it's just not realistic, right? But that was Kennedy. He mastered the television as a way of connecting with the people, as seen in his defeat of Nixon in the first nationally televised debate in 1960. But coming into office, Kennedy is going to have to deal with the fact that a island nation just south of Florida by 90 miles by the name of Cuba had just recently come under the rule of their communist dictator Fidel Castro. This is unacceptable to the United States, having a communist regime 90 miles outside of our borders. And so Kennedy signs off on the CIA's plan to remove Castro, known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. This fails embarrassingly for the United States. Kennedy does not take any of the blame. He blames it on the CIA director, Allen Dulles, fires him. And this will, of course, be followed up by the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Castro asked the Soviet Union for intercontinental ballistic missiles to place upon his island as protection for another Bay of Pigs type coup orchestrated by the United States. The United States finds out that they are building this by illegally flying U-2 spy planes over the island, and it results in probably the closest the world came to a nuclear war that we're aware of during the Cold War, that results in the United States quarantining Cuba and the United Nations intervening to secure the removal of those missiles out of Cuba, with the U.S.'s promise that we remove our missiles from Turkey, et cetera, et cetera. So not a great start to the administration for Kennedy, the embarrassment of the Bay of Pigs, and then also the potential of we were on the brink of a nuclear war with the Cuban Missile Crisis. But that's only a part of the Kennedy administration, which of course tragically lasts only 2 years, 10 months, and 2 days, when he is assassinated November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas, by a Soviet sympathizer, Lee Harvey Oswald. But Kennedy is a great example of a president leading against majority opinion in the civil rights movement. He takes a leading stance on the fact that civil rights needs to come to African Americans and other marginalized and oppressed groups within the United States, standing strong in support of civil rights advocates like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The majority was not for this in the 1960s. And so it is a courageous stance taken by Kennedy to stand against the majority and to stand with minority rights of saying we have to do the right thing, standing behind the Supreme Court's decision of Brown versus Board of Education back in 1954 that deemed separate but equal illegal in public school systems, standing behind the integration of the University of Mississippi by ordering the National Guard and troops to forcibly integrate that institution when James Meredith was denied enrollment, and others as well afterwards, standing against the so-called Dixiecrats, the Democrats of the southern states that were for segregation, like George Wallace and Strom Thurmond, and which really is a very risky thing, because if you lose those southern Democrats, you're splitting your party. It could tragically paralyze the party for for the ability to win a national election. So in many ways, Kennedy was courageous for standing with civil rights and with the civil rights protesters in Birmingham in '63, and standing with those who led boycotts and sit-ins and freedom rides. This was a politically risky maneuver, but one that was the right thing and something that we should applaud Kennedy for as a result of that. Now, what takes place as a result of Kennedy's assassination is Lyndon Johnson becomes president of the United States. He will lead through Congress passage of a multitude of landmark civil rights pieces of legislation, like the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, support for the 24th Amendment outlawing the poll tax, et cetera, et cetera. So this is sort of the crowning achievements of the civil rights movement. Although, as we know, a lot of those achievements were simply words on paper. It would take decades to actually see states enforce them with this whole Democratic Southern States' Rights Party, right? Those Dixiecrats saying we're not going to enforce laws that we disagree with. It's a state right. But ultimately, the other part of the Lyndon Johnson administration was what he called the Great Society. And this is going to be the great expansion of the New Deal: Medicare, Medicaid, affirmative action, Title IX, housing and urban development, Head Start programs. This is that great expansion of welfare where Lyndon Johnson declared his war on poverty, right? We're going to try to end poverty and end want throughout the United States. And while there were great achievements made through a lot of these programs, again, sort of an unrealistic sort of goal to wipe out poverty throughout the United States from head to toe, right? But simply this great achievement in many of those programs that are still a part of our lives today, much like a lot of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal policies are like that, are part of our lives today as well. But ultimately, the 1960s are known as a very turbulent period within the United States because of our involvement in the Vietnam War. Our involvement begins with the Eisenhower administration, in which Eisenhower declares the falling domino principle, that this domino theory, that if one nation in Southeast Asia falls to communism, the rest will soon follow, as a part of our larger policy of containment. We will support the South Vietnamese with advisors, and ultimately, by the time the Johnson administration is in office, we will become militarily involved with troops on the ground. And in a nutshell, and it's hard to do in such a short sort of introductory video like this, we will have advisors in Vietnam, and as a result of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, Lyndon Johnson will be given wartime powers without a congressional check. As Lyndon Johnson called it, it's like grandma's night dress. It covers everything. He was able to send as many troops and spend as much money as he wanted in Vietnam to stop the northern invasion of spreading communism from North Vietnam to South Vietnam without congressional approval or check. And there's a reason why we have those checks in place, right? It was a disaster, and it allowed us to become engaged in this conflict here into what would become a call to quagmire, where we fought the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong methods. Nothing worked. And as the North Vietnamese under Ho Chi Minh would say, nothing can be done when an entire nation stands up. The history of Vietnam is that they were demanding self-determination. They had never had it. And the reality was, this was less of a communist regime than it was a Vietnamese nationalist regime. The Vietnamese people wanted foreigners out of their nation. They wanted the ability to choose their own government and live their own lives. The Americans were just simply the latest in a long line of French and Chinese and Japanese occupiers. And an entire nation did rise up, and ultimately this led to America's first military defeat on foreign soil. And this will be discussed in the next chapter. But you see in the 60s, under Johnson, the beginning of what we start to call the credibility gap. The Vietnam War will be the first, what we call the television war, the living room war. Images are in Americans' living rooms every night. Lyndon Johnson will get on television and tell Americans we are winning, and the images that they're seeing on television do not reconcile with that. They are contradictory to what Johnson is saying. And this will lead to the counterculture movement, Woodstock, the hippies, so to speak, where you have young people that are rejecting the government, and they're saying the government lies to us. We can't trust them. Bring our boys home. People evading the draft, fighting the war, and beginning of the SDS, the Students for Democratic Society, which is the new left. These young people that are going to reject the Democratic Party. And then you have on the other side the Young Americans for Freedom, the conservative group, saying when we're at war, we support our government, period, right? And that became sort of the conservative Republican side of it, which will lead to the successful election of President Richard Nixon in 1968 against the Democratic nominee Hubert Humphrey, who will basically run when Johnson bows out. Johnson was so unpopular by 4 years of Vietnam, and for the reasons that I said, that he won't even run for reelection, which is almost unheard of. Although we have just recently in our history, just this last year, have an incumbent president eligible for a second term choose to not seek reelection.